450 million years ago, in an ocean that covered most of what is now the North American continent, something was already hunting. It had no bones and no jaw, as you would recognize one. But it left behind something unmistakable in the sediment. Tiny structures, each one smaller than a grain of sand, pressed into rock that would not be examined by human hands until the 21st century. Those structures were dermal denticles, the microscopic tooth-like scales that cover a shark's body, giving its skin that distinctive sandpaper texture you feel if you run your hand the wrong way across it. That was the late Ordovician period. The first trees would not stand on dry land for another 65 million years after that. And to understand how long 65 million years truly is, consider this. 65 million years is the exact distance in time that separates you right now from the last living Tyrannosaurus rex. The entire age of mammals, every primate, every whale, every ice age, every ancestor who ever chipped a stone tool, fits inside the head start that sharks had on trees. Sharks were ancient before forests were even a concept on this planet. So how does a group of animals persist for nearly 500 million years? A span of time so vast it contains 5 separate mass extinctions, each one capable of erasing the majority of complex life on Earth, and come out the other side still hunting, still adapting, still here. The answer reaches back to an ocean you would not recognize, a planet without a single forest, a body built on principles that defy the standard rules of vertebrate survival, and a living individual swimming right now beneath the Arctic ice that may have been born before the Pilgrims reached North America. It was the late Ordovician, roughly 450 million years ago, and the planet looked nothing like the world you inhabit today. The continents were clustered in the southern hemisphere, locked together in a supercontinent called Gondwana that spanned from the South Pole toward the equator. The air carried no scent of soil or pine or decay. There was no reason it would. Land, in the way you think of it, was essentially barren. Low mats of green algae and primitive mosses clung to coastal rocks in thin, fragile films. There were no roots breaking through stone, no canopy filtering sunlight, and nothing standing taller than your ankle across the entire surface of every continent on Earth. But the ocean was alive in ways the land could not yet approach. In 2012, Ivan Sansom at the University of Birmingham published an analysis of fossilized dermal denticles recovered from late Ordovician sedimentary deposits in Colorado. The specimens dated to approximately 450 million years ago, pushing the confirmed origin of shark-like vertebrates back tens of millions of years earlier than the previous consensus had accepted. Before Sansom's work, the scientific community placed the first sharks firmly in the Devonian period, roughly 380 to 400 million years ago. His denticles, pressed into rock that predated the Devonian by more than 50 million years, a gap equivalent to the entire Cenozoic era, forced a fundamental recalibration of the shark evolutionary timeline. Not all paleontologists agreed that Sansom's denticles belonged to true sharks in the modern sense. Some argued the structures could represent a different branch of early jawed or jawless vertebrates. But subsequent discoveries, including Ordovician-aged denticles recovered from sites in Mongolia and the Arabian Peninsula, and analyzed by independent teams, strengthened the case. The emerging picture is that the shark lineage, or its immediate precursors, was already established by the late Ordovician. Sharks are older than we thought, and they were older than we thought by a margin that itself exceeds the lifespan of most animal lineages in the fossil record. If you want the full system behind the deep history we cover on this channel, from evolutionary timelines to extinction mechanisms to survival blueprints, the ebook is linked in the description. It goes well beyond what any single video can cover. The sharks that left those early scales behind were nothing like the animals you picture when you hear the word. They had no hinged jaw. They belonged to a lineage that predated the entire evolutionary invention of jaw articulation, a structure so fundamental to modern vertebrates that imagining a predator without one feels almost paradoxical. These were creatures navigating a warm, shallow ocean filled with armored fish covered in thick, bony plates, giant sea scorpions called eurypterids that grew longer than a full-grown human being, about 2 meters from head to tail spike, and trilobites that had already been crawling across the seafloor for over 100 million years before the first shark showed up. And yet, despite arriving into an ocean already dominated by heavily armored competitors, the early sharks persisted. They persisted because their bodies were built on a different principle. Their skeletons were made of cartilage, not bone. Cartilage is lighter, more flexible, and requires less metabolic energy to grow and maintain than dense bone tissue. In an aquatic environment where buoyancy handles most of the structural workload, the lightness of cartilage translated directly into efficiency. A shark could patrol a larger range on fewer calories than an equivalently sized bony fish. That edge was slight. But slight edges, compounded across tens of millions of years of natural selection, become the difference between lineages that persist and lineages that vanish into the sediment. The trade-off is the reason the early chapters of shark evolution are so difficult to read. Cartilage does not fossilize well. It compresses under geological pressure, dissolves in acidic groundwater, and disintegrates across the weight of deep time. What survives are teeth, denticles, and the occasional calcified spine or jaw fragment. Reconstructing a 450-million-year-old shark from its scattered denticles is like trying to rebuild an entire cathedral from a handful of floor tiles. You can prove the building existed. You cannot tell anyone with certainty what it looked like. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Because while sharks were diversifying in the Ordovician and Silurian oceans, adapting and specializing across tens of millions of years of warm, shallow seas, something was conspicuously not happening on land. And the absence of that something is one of the strangest facts in the entire geological record. There were no trees, not one, anywhere on the planet. For more than 100 million years after the first simple plants colonized land around 470 million years ago, the terrestrial world stayed flat. Mosses, liverworts, and small vascular plants spread across coastal margins and river deltas, but the tallest of them barely reached your knee. Wood had not been invented yet as a structural material. Not a single shadow on the planet's land surface extended more than a few inches. Picture the coastline of that ancient world. Waves breaking against gray and rust-colored rock, and behind the rock, an expanse of green so low and uniform it looked like carpet. No vertical structure anywhere. When it rained, the water ran off the land almost immediately because there were no root systems to slow it down or absorb it. The rivers that formed were nothing like modern rivers. They were shallow braided channels that shifted constantly across flat alluvial plains, carrying sediment straight into the ocean because there was nothing on the shore to hold the land in place. Continent-spanning landmasses, some of them larger than modern Africa, covered in nothing but a thin green crust. The soil itself barely existed in any meaningful sense. Without deep root systems to break down rock and bind sediment, erosion was ferocious. The landscape looked closer to Mars with a coat of lichen than to anything you would recognize as Earth. And this barren state persisted, while sharks evolved, diversified, and produced multiple lineages of increasingly sophisticated predators across more than 60 million years of open ocean. 60 million years of shark evolution. 0 years of trees. The oceans were already teeming with complex vertebrate hunters, while the land had not yet figured out how to stand up. Then, approximately 385 million years ago, something finally changed. In 2007, William Stein at Binghamton University and Christopher Berry at Cardiff University published a paper in the journal Nature that identified the oldest known tree species in the fossil record. The species was called Watiesa, and the fossils came from a quarry near the town of Gilboa in upstate New York. Stein's team had matched a set of leaf-crowned branch fossils to a mysterious trunk structure that had been found at the exact same site back in the 1870s, but never successfully identified. When the pieces were finally connected more than a century later, they revealed a tree that stood roughly 8 meters tall, about the height of a 2-story building, with a crown of fern-like fronds and a trunk reinforced by material structurally similar to wood. Watiesa was not alone for long. Within a few million years of its appearance in the fossil record, a genus called Archaeopteris spread across the supercontinent of Laurussia, forming the first true forests on Earth. These were forests without flowers, without fruit, without any of the sounds you would associate with a woodland today. But they had trunks, canopies, and root systems capable of pulling carbon dioxide from the atmosphere at a scale that nothing on land had ever achieved before. The consequences were staggering. Trees accelerated the chemical weathering of rock through their expanding root networks, drawing carbon out of the atmosphere and locking it into the soil. Over millions of years, atmospheric carbon dioxide levels dropped dramatically. Oxygen levels rose. the climate cooled. And here is the detail that changes the math entirely. The evolution of trees did not just transform the land. It triggered one of the most severe ecological disruptions in the history of the ocean. As nutrient-rich soil washed from newly forested coastlines into shallow marine environments, it fueled massive algal blooms that consumed the dissolved oxygen in the water column. The result was widespread anoxia, oxygen dead zones spreading across the continental shelves. The same process, eutrophication, that creates dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico today, was happening on a planetary scale roughly 370 million years ago, and it became one of the contributing factors behind the late Devonian extinction events that killed approximately 75% of all species on Earth, a proportion equivalent to losing 3 out of every 4 species currently alive in the modern ocean. Think about that the next time you walk through a forest. The trees around you are descendants of organisms that, when they first appeared, helped trigger one of the deadliest marine catastrophes in the history of the planet. Trees arrived, and they nearly killed the ocean. The sharks that survived the late Devonian were the ones that could tolerate the changing chemistry of the water, shift their ranges into deeper or better oxygenated zones, alter their diets, and endure conditions that drove their more specialized relatives to extinction. This was not the last time sharks would face annihilation. It was not even close to the worst time. But it established a pattern that would repeat across the next 350 million years. The world changes. Everything else dies. Sharks adapt. For a while after the late Devonian extinctions, the ocean actually stabilized. The Carboniferous period, spanning roughly 360 to 300 million years ago, became a time of extraordinary shark diversity. Paleontologists sometimes call it the golden age of sharks, and the name is earned. The fossil record from this era reveals a bewildering range of body plans, feeding strategies, and ecological roles that make the modern diversity of sharks look narrow and conservative by comparison. Consider Stethecanthus. This was a shark roughly the length of a dining table, about 2 meters, that carried a flat-topped anvil-shaped structure on its back where a dorsal fin should have been. The entire upper surface of the structure was covered in tiny teeth-like denticles, and a matching patch of denticles covered the shark's forehead. After 3 decades of study, no one has reached a definitive consensus on what the structure was for. Display during mating season, species recognition at a distance, some undetermined hydrodynamic function during pursuit. Every hypothesis has its supporters and its detractors. The honest answer is that Stethecanthus evolved a body feature so alien to modern biology that it remains unexplained, despite extensive investigation. Or consider Helicoprion. This was a shark, or possibly a close relative of true sharks, that carried a spiral whorl of teeth in its lower jaw, arranged like a circular saw blade curling backward into the throat. A single whorl could contain more than 150 individual teeth. For over a century after the first fossils were described by Alexander Karpinski in 1899, paleontologists could not agree on where in the animal's body the whorl was even located. Some reconstructions placed it on the tip of the snout like a grotesque nasal ornament. Others dangled it beneath the lower jaw. Others attached it to the dorsal fin. It was not until 2013, when Leif Tapanila at Idaho State University used CT scanning technology on a well-preserved specimen from Idaho, that the position was finally confirmed. The whorl sat in the lower jaw, and the shark used it to slice through soft-bodied prey like squid and ammonites in a rolling, shearing motion unlike anything found in the modern ocean. I mean, think about that for a second. A circular saw made entirely of teeth, built into the jaw of an animal that lived 270 million years ago, and the species persisted for over 100 million years. Helicoprion outlasted entire geological periods. It watched ecosystems assemble and collapse around it while it kept shearing through cephalopods with dental hardware that looks like it belongs in a machine shop. These were not primitive organisms fumbling through early evolution. They were sophisticated predators occupying ecological niches that modern sharks do not even attempt to fill. The Carboniferous Ocean was a laboratory of evolutionary experimentation, where the basic shark body plan proved flexible enough to produce forms that look closer to science fiction than to marine biology. Then came the worst day in the history of complex life on Earth. Approximately 252 million years ago, at the boundary between the Permian and Triassic periods, the Siberian Traps erupted. This was not a single volcanic explosion. It was a geological convulsion that lasted roughly 1 million years, producing enough basalt lava to cover an area the size of Western Europe to a depth of several hundred meters. The eruptions released staggering quantities of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, driving global temperatures upward by an estimated 10 degrees Celsius, roughly 18 degrees Fahrenheit, over the course of the event. The oceans warmed, they acidified, they lost their dissolved oxygen. The result was the end Permian extinction, sometimes called the Great Dying. An estimated 96% of all marine species went extinct. To grasp what 96% actually means at the scale of an entire ocean, imagine a coral reef teeming with 1,000 different species of fish, invertebrates, corals, and algae. After the end Permian, roughly 40 of those species remain. The reef is gone. The food web that sustained it is gone. The chemical conditions that allowed it to exist in the first place will not return for millions of years. That is the kind of number that makes paleontologists go quiet when they see it on a chart. On land, roughly 70% of all terrestrial vertebrate species vanished. The forest collapsed. Fungal spikes in the geological records suggest that for a period after the extinction, the land surface of entire continents was dominated not by living plants, but by fungi feeding on the dead wood of a world that had, in geological terms, emptied overnight. Sharks were not spared. Many of the lineages that had thrived during the Carboniferous and Permian, including highly specialized forms like Helicoprion, disappeared at the boundary. The diversity that had defined the Golden Age was devastated. But some lineages survived. In 2018, Catalina Pimiento at the University of Zurich and colleagues published a comprehensive analysis of shark diversity patterns across all 5 major mass extinctions, using data from the paleobiology database spanning hundreds of millions of years. Their findings confirmed what the fossil record had hinted at for decades. Sharks as a group displayed a remarkable capacity to persist through extinction events that destroyed the majority of marine life around them. Not unscathed. Their diversity dropped sharply at each boundary, but enough lineages survived every single time to seed the next radiation of new species. The pattern held across 450 million years and 5 separate catastrophes, each one driven by fundamentally different mechanisms, from ocean chemistry shifts to asteroid impacts. Pimiento's analysis pointed to several factors that explained this resilience. Sharks occupied such a wide range of ecological niches, from deep-water scavengers operating at crushing pressures to shallow reef predators to open ocean pursuit hunters, that no single environmental disruption could eliminate all of them simultaneously. Their cartilaginous skeletons required less metabolic energy to maintain than the bony skeletons of their competitors, which mattered enormously during extended periods of ecosystem collapse when calories were scarce. And their reproductive strategies, ranging from egg-laying to live birth to intrauterine cannibalism depending on the species, gave them a flexibility that more reproductively rigid lineages simply did not have. The sharks that emerged from the end Permian were not the same animals that went in. They were fewer in number, far less diverse, and operating in an ocean that had been fundamentally restructured by the extinction. But they were alive, and within a few million years, they were diversifying again, filling the ecological voids left by the hundreds of species that had not made it through. They survived the end Triassic extinction 201 million years ago, which killed roughly 80% of all species and cleared the ecological stage for the rise of the dinosaurs. During the Mesozoic era that followed, while tyrannosaurs and sauropods dominated the continents, sharks like Hybotus cruised the warm, shallow seas alongside marine reptiles like ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs. Hybotus was a generalist, roughly 1.5 meters long, about the height of an average adult human standing upright, with 2 distinctly different types of teeth in its jaw: sharp, pointed teeth in the front for catching fish, and flat, crushing teeth in the back for breaking open shellfish and crustaceans. That dual dentition made it adaptable. When one food source became scarce due to environmental shifts, Hybotus could switch to another without requiring any evolutionary modification at all. That flexibility is why Hybotus appears in the fossil record for over 160 million years, spanning from the late Permian all the way through to the end of the Cretaceous. one of the longest continuous runs of any vertebrate genus in Earth's history. Then, 66 million years ago, when an asteroid roughly 10 kilometers wide, about the width of Manhattan, struck what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico and triggered a global firestorm followed by a winter that blocked sunlight for months and ended the entire Mesozoic era, sharks survived that too. Hybotis did not make it through the Cretaceous boundary, but other shark lineages, the more generalized, more ecologically flexible branches of the family tree, emerged on the other side into a world suddenly emptied of the great marine reptiles that had competed with them for 135 million years. In the millions of years that followed, sharks produced forms that filled the ecological vacuum left by the vanished reptiles. Otodus megalodon appeared roughly 23 million years ago and persisted until approximately 3.6 million years ago. Based on tooth fossils measuring up to 18 centimeters long, about the length of an adult human hand from wrist to fingertip, researchers estimate that megalodon reached body lengths of 15 to 18 meters, roughly the length of a standard bowling lane. It was an apex predator of the warm coastal seas, a pursuit hunter large enough to prey on small whales. Catalina Pimiento, now at Swansea University, published research in 2016 suggesting that megalodon's extinction coincided with a period of ocean cooling and the decline of the shallow coastal habitats where its primary prey concentrated. The planet changed, and megalodon could not follow. But other shark lineages, the smaller, more generalized, more adaptable branches of the tree, could, and did. Each time the world threw something catastrophic at them, the same pattern held: devastation, loss of diversity, persistence of a core group of adaptable lineages, and eventual recovery into new forms. 5 mass extinctions across 450 million years, and the sharks are still here. If you have watched this far, you already know that this channel does not cover surface-level history. We go into the mechanisms, the evidence, and the timescales that mainstream documentaries skip over. If you want more of this, hit subscribe now. The algorithm stops recommending channels you do not subscribe to, and there is a new deep dive every single week. By the early 21st century, marine biologists understood that sharks as a lineage were ancient. But in 2016, a study published in the journal Science by Julius Nielsen at the University of Copenhagen revealed something that even experienced shark researchers found difficult to absorb. Individual sharks could be ancient too. Nielsen's team had spent years studying Greenland sharks, a species called Somniosus microcephalus that inhabits the deep, near-freezing waters of the North Atlantic and Arctic Oceans. Greenland sharks are enormous, reaching lengths of over 5 meters, longer than a standard family sedan, and they move through the water column at speeds so slow they were historically called sleeper sharks. Their metabolism is among the lowest of any vertebrate ever measured. Everything about them operates on a biological timescale that makes other large predators look frantic by comparison. Nielsen wanted to determine how old they actually were. The traditional method for aging sharks involves counting growth rings in their vertebrae, similar to counting rings in a cross-section of tree trunk. But Greenland sharks have soft, poorly calcified vertebrae that do not produce reliable growth rings. So Nielsen's team developed a different approach entirely. They measured the radiocarbon isotope ratios in the crystalline proteins at the center of the shark's eye lenses. Here is why that works. The proteins in the innermost layer of a Greenland shark's eye lens are formed before the animal is born and remain chemically stable for the rest of its life. They never turn over, they never regenerate. They sit in the center of the lens like a sealed time capsule, preserving the carbon isotope signature of the ocean water the mother shark was swimming in at the moment those proteins were originally assembled inside the embryo. By analyzing the radiocarbon ratios in the eye lenses of 28 female Greenland sharks of varying sizes, Nielsen's team could work backward and estimate when each animal had been born. The results landed like a depth charge in the field of marine biology. The oldest shark in the study had an estimated age of 392 years, with an uncertainty range of plus or minus 120 years. That placed its likely birth somewhere between 1504 and 1744. The midpoint estimate was approximately 1624. To translate that into human terms, this single shark may have been alive when Shakespeare was still performing at the Globe Theatre. It was swimming beneath the surface of the North Atlantic when the Mayflower crossed the same water above it in 1620. It was already centuries old when the American and French revolutions were fought, when Napoleon marched across Europe, when the first telegraph wire was strung. And it is still alive. In 392 years was the estimate for the oldest individual in a sample of only 28 animals. Nielsen himself acknowledged that larger, older Greenland sharks almost certainly exist in the deep Arctic waters that have never been systematically surveyed. Individuals that have never been captured, tagged, or measured by any research vessel. The species' maximum lifespan may exceed 500 years, half a millennium. A single organism, still swimming, still hunting, still reproducing in water so cold and dark that no photon of sunlight penetrates to its depth. Think about what that shark has lived through, every war of the last 4 centuries, every empire that rose and crumbled, every revolution, every pandemic, every technological leap from the printing press to the communications satellite. And the shark was doing the same thing through all of it. Moving slowly through black water beneath the Arctic ice, following the electrical signatures of fish buried in the sediment, growing 1 centimeter per year, about half the width of your thumbnail. Unhurried, unchanged, present. There is a parasite, a copepod, called Omatocoita elongata, that commonly attaches itself to the corneas of Greenland sharks and feeds on the surface tissue of the eye. Over time, the parasite damages the shark's vision, sometimes severely. Many large Greenland sharks are partially or completely blind. And yet they continue to hunt, navigate, reproduce, and survive in the lightless depths of the Arctic, relying on senses that do not require sight. Electroreception, which detects the faint electrical fields of nearby prey. Olfaction, which traces chemical gradients through water across extraordinary distances. A blind predator, older than most nations currently on any world map, still operating successfully in one of the harshest environments on the planet. Nielsen's study confirmed Somniosus microcephalus as the longest-lived vertebrate ever documented, surpassing the previous record holder, the bowhead whale, by more than 2 centuries. Part of the explanation lies in the Greenland shark's metabolic rate. The water temperatures these animals inhabit hover between -1 and 5 degrees Celsius, barely above the freezing point of seawater. At those temperatures, every chemical reaction in the body runs in slow motion. Cell division slows. Oxidative damage, the molecular wear and tear that drives the aging process in warmer organisms, accumulates at a fraction of the normal rate. A 5-meter Greenland shark may have taken 300 years just to reach its full size. It does not appear to reach sexual maturity until it is estimated to be roughly 150 years old, an age that exceeds the maximum lifespan of every land mammal on Earth. The Greenland shark is not just old, it is old in a way that forces you to reconsider what the word even means when applied to a living organism. But individual longevity, as staggering as it is, does not fully explain why sharks as a group have survived for 450 million years. The deeper answer lies in the structural advantages embedded in their biology, advantages that have been compounding across geological time. The cartilaginous skeleton is one element. Lighter than bone, cheaper to build and maintain metabolically, and flexible enough to absorb impacts and stresses that would fracture rigid skeletal structures. In water, where buoyancy offsets most gravitational load, the energy savings of cartilage compound over a lifetime and compound again across evolutionary timescales. Every calorie a shark does not spend on maintaining a heavy skeleton is a calorie available for growth, reproduction, or simply surviving a lean season. The sensory system is another element entirely. Sharks possess electroreceptors called the ampullae of Lorenzini, specialized pore-like organs distributed across the head and snout that detect the faint electrical fields generated by the muscle contractions and nerve impulses of other living organisms. The sensitivity is almost absurd when you quantify it. A shark can detect an electrical field as weak as 5 nanovolts per centimeter. That is a signal so faint it is equivalent to sensing the voltage of a single AA battery from a distance of roughly 1/600 kilometers, about the distance from London to Rome. In total darkness, in murky water, buried under sand, it does not matter. If something nearby has a heartbeat, the shark knows it is there. And this is not a recent innovation. The ampullae of Lorenzini appear in the fossil record, alongside some of the earliest sharks. The same sensory hardware that allows a modern great white to locate a stingray hidden under sand on the seafloor has been operating in modified forms for hundreds of millions of years. And then there is the reproductive flexibility. Different shark species employ radically different strategies for producing offspring. Some lay tough, leathery egg cases, sometimes called mermaid's purses, that can survive for months on the ocean floor while the embryo develops inside. Others retain the eggs internally and give birth to fully formed live young. Some species practice oophagy, where developing embryos feed on unfertilized eggs provided by the mother inside the womb. Sand tiger sharks take it a step further still, with the largest embryo consuming its smaller siblings before birth in a process called intrauterine cannibalism, so that only 1 or 2 pups emerge, already large and battle-tested before they have taken their first breath of open water. The range of strategies across the group is enormous, and that range is itself one of the most potent survival mechanisms in the animal kingdom. When an extinction event selectively destroys one reproductive niche, species using different strategies survive and carry the lineage forward. The group is not a single bet placed on one table. It is hundreds of simultaneous bets distributed across every ocean basin on the planet. This redundancy is the key to understanding 450 million years of unbroken persistence. Sharks are not one solution to the problem of survival. They are a portfolio of solutions spread across thousands of species and dozens of ecological roles, from deep-sea scavengers cruising at crushing pressures to coastal nursery dwellers, to open-water apex predators patrolling the sunlit zone. When a mass extinction wipes out 90% of those solutions, the remaining 10% still contains enough biological and ecological diversity to seed the next radiation of new forms. The lineage bends under the weight of catastrophe. It does not break. And it has been bending and recovering for longer than trees, flowers, mammals, birds, and dinosaurs have existed on this planet. The part that keeps researchers awake at night is what is happening right now. In 2013, Boris Worm at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Canada, published an estimate in the journal Marine Policy that approximately 100 million sharks are killed by human activity every year. 100 million. To visualize that number, imagine every person in the nation of Germany killed in a single year. Now imagine it happening again the next year. And the year after that, without pause. The primary driver is the global shark fin trade. Shark fin soup, a status dish served at banquets and celebrations across parts of East and Southeast Asia, requires only the fins. The remainder of the animal, often still alive and conscious, is thrown back into the water to sink to the ocean floor and suffocate. This practice, called finning, accounts for an estimated 73 million shark deaths annually on its own. Additional mortality comes from bycatch and commercial longline and trawl fisheries, recreational fishing, habitat degradation in the coastal nursery areas where juvenile sharks develop, and the slow cumulative disruption of ocean chemistry through acidification and warming. In 2021, Nathan Pacaro and colleagues at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia published a study in the journal Nature reporting that global populations of oceanic sharks and rays had declined by an estimated 71% since 1970. 71% in just over 50 years. 3/4 of all oceanic shark and ray species are now classified as threatened with extinction by the International Union for Conservation of Nature. And no, I am not making that up. An animal that survived 5 mass extinctions, that outlasted the dinosaurs by 66 million years, and counting, that was already ancient when the first tree pushed its trunk above the soil on a barren Devonian shoreline, is now being driven toward population collapse by a single species that has existed for roughly 300,000 years. 300,000 years against 450 million, humans have occupied less than 0.1% of the time that sharks have been present on this planet. And in that sliver we have accomplished what 5 mass extinctions, each one driven by forces operating at the scale of entire continents and atmospheres, could not. The mechanisms that carried sharks through the end Permian, through the asteroid strike at the Cretaceous boundary, through the ice ages and the ocean dead zones and the volcanic winters, cannot protect them from industrial fishing gear. The electroreceptors that detect a heartbeat at 5 nanovolts cannot detect a baited longline hook drifting through the water column. The reproductive flexibility that enabled recovery after each mass extinction operates on timescales of millions of years, and modern fishing removes individuals faster than populations can replace themselves. Many shark species do not reach sexual maturity until they are 15 or 20 years old. The Greenland shark does not reproduce until it is estimated to be over 150. A fishery that harvests faster than a population can breed is doing something that no volcanic eruption, no asteroid impact, no planetary chemical shift has ever managed. It is removing the animals without giving the evolutionary machinery any time to respond. And this is where the timeline stops making comfortable sense. The same slow metabolism that allows a Greenland shark to live for 4 or 5 centuries makes the species agonizingly slow to replenish its numbers. The same ecological spread that ensured some shark lineage always survived a mass extinction becomes meaningless when every niche is being depleted at the same time by the same global fishing industry. The advantages that carried sharks through 450 million years of planetary upheaval are, for the first time in their entire evolutionary history, operating in an environment that moves faster than they can adapt. The real question is not whether sharks can survive another extinction event. They have proven, across 500 million years and 5 catastrophic boundaries, that the answer is yes. The real question is whether they can survive the only extinction in Earth's history where the cause has the ability to choose to stop. Because the machinery inside a shark is ancient. It was forged across a stretch of time so vast that the evolution of trees, the rise and fall of every dinosaur species, and the entire arc of human civilization, from the first stone tool to this exact moment, all fit within it. That machinery has never failed. Not once in 450 million years of continuous operation. But it was never calibrated for an opponent that could empty an ocean in a single generation and call it commerce. Think about what it means that an animal born before the Renaissance, swimming right now under the Arctic ice with parasites clouding its ancient eyes, carrying in its lens proteins the carbon signature of a world that existed before your nation was founded, could be hauled up in a trawl net tomorrow afternoon. 4 centuries of unbroken survival ended by an hour of bycatch. The geological record has written the story of sharks for 450 million years. It has recorded their survival through planetary catastrophes that would seem like science fiction if they were not preserved in the rock beneath your feet. And in all that time, the record has never had to write the sentence that says the sharks are gone. Whether it has to write that sentence now is not up to the sharks. It never was. It is up to the only species young enough to still have a choice. If you want to see what else the deep record reveals about survival, extinction, and the thin margin between the two, click the video on screen right now.